Hi and welcome to my channel. This video took a really long time to plan. I've been working on it for like a week, and it's partly because this is a new project. This is only my third video, so I was kind of tempted to just go on as I'd planned and just talk about the things that I had lined up already, but then at the same time those things weren't addressing Black Lives Matter or what is happening in the world, and that struck me that to just sort of ignore all that stuff would be really tone deaf. So I'm not going to ignore it, I'm going to talk about it. I have to sort of hold my hands up and admit my ignorance to begin with. There is so much I still need to understand and explore and read and educate myself about. I started doing that recently, first of all with some reading. I've just started Audre Lorde's Sister Outsider. I read about 50 pages of it this morning, and it's a really beautiful, really inclusive text so far that discusses race and also sexuality, gender, and poetry. Who wouldn't love that? It's so beautiful. Meanwhile, I am waiting for my copy of Reni Eddo-Lodge's Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, which I ordered like 2 weeks ago and still hasn't come, so I hope that's because everyone else is reading it, and I will read it as soon as I have it. So before I dive in, do my usual spoiler alert. This is a channel rife with spoilers because I'm talking about readings of texts, and therefore I'm not skimping on detail. This week, more than ever, I would like that spoiler alert to resound strongly, because not only am I talking about a text where I'm going to discuss the very end of the film, but it is a film that you do not want spoiled for yourself. So if you have not seen Jordan Peele's 2017 film Get Out, go and watch it before you watch this video. It's so good, and you do not want me to spoil it for you. If, however, you've already seen it, I'm going to give you a very brief outline. So if you haven't seen it, your spoilers start right now. So here is my very brief outline of the film Get Out. A black man named Chris visits his white girlfriend's family in the country and discovers that the family are recruiting black people into whom they implant their own brains so they can live longer in physically superior bodies. My first impression of rewatching it this weekend was that it is absolutely a pleasure to watch. It is so much fun, this film. It is so entertaining, and it is rich, and it is got just a little bit of gore. It's cathartic, and it's also quite awkward to watch as a white person, and I think it should be. I think if you watch this film and you're not a little bit awkward, then you maybe need to be just a little bit more self-critical.
How long has this been going on, this thing?
The second thing I wanted to say about this film, sort of cop to, is that I think it's quite an easy way into looking at issues of race, partly because it is such a pleasure to watch, it is so cathartic and entertaining, but also because I think it very consciously addresses its non-black audience as well as its black audience. It's also set in a really white world. It basically takes place at this country house, and I've been to family gatherings at places like that. Third, I think I should, it's worth saying that this is not a film that stares down the barrel of the most obviously horrific forms of racism. This is not 12 Years a Slave. I think 12 Years a Slave is the type of film that is really important because it doesn't flinch away from looking at some of the true brutality. I would sort of recommend it, although I don't know if I'll ever be able to watch it again. It was a really tough watch, but it is an extraordinary film, directed by Steve McQueen. So I don't have an overriding argument today. I just have a sort of reflection on reading the film in a 2020 Black Lives Matter world from my admittedly super white middle class perspective, because that's what I've got, guys. That's what I've got. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is the idea of a post-racial world. So this film was written, and I think it was mostly in production, when Obama was still in office. And I think that was a time when it was easier to pretend that we lived in a post-racial world. It was quite easy to point at a black president and be like, look how far we've come. I think that feeling of look how far we've come is even stronger in the UK, where the oppression and brutality towards black people is less obvious unless you do the work to look for it. I think also there is a sense that it is less deadly to be black in the UK, but I have a feeling that is largely because we have fewer guns than they do in America. So I think we shouldn't forget that, you know, weapons are not hate. Weapons just enable acts of hate. Get Out is a satire, and I'm going to quote here from an essay called Get Out Explained: Symbols, Satire and Social Horror, which I will link below. It says, Get Out is a satire not targeted at overt racism. It's a commentary on a certain kind of smug, white, liberal mindset. The Armitages, that's the family, the white family in the film, believe they are forward-thinking. Peele said that he made the film because there was a void in the way we talk about race. Racism was not being called out sufficiently enough. In the film, there's this phrase that is said twice. First time it's said to Chris by Rose, his girlfriend, and she's sort of encouraging him, like, don't worry, my parents aren't racist, you can come and visit them. And she says, look, my dad would have voted for Obama a third time. And then when they get to the house, her dad sort of duly parrots this phrase and says, I would have voted for Obama a third time. Peele says that the way that white people in the film talk about race is not hateful. It's an olive branch, but they're still being seen for their colour first. So it's a shade of this mess we call racism. And Daniel Kaluuya, who plays Chris, also reiterated this by saying that it's a miscommunication of intention, because what you're trying to do as a white individual is make someone feel welcome, but how it's received is that he feels isolated. So it's like drawing attention to the difference. You know, if you meet someone and you're like, oh, that's so great, I went there as well, you are drawing someone into a shared experience. But if you're like, I love black people, you're really just pointing out that they are other. The film actually goes much further than that. It actually sort of fetishizes blackness. There are people in the film who sort of openly talk about how, like, black people run faster or are better in bed or are stronger, cooler. That's a big thing. Blackness is not actually just like, oh, we're okay with it. It's actually like, we particularly like it. And I think that sort of fetishization of it even takes that gesture further in making Chris feels particularly uncomfortable. Ultimately, and I think the feeling that you should get from the film if you're watching it properly, is that the aim is not to be able to say, I don't see colour. You should be able to see colour and appreciate difference and see genuine shared experience that crosses racial, national, gender, sexuality divides. The second thing I want to talk about is the idea that colour is more than skin deep. So there are more white actors working in this film than there are black actors, which I thought was interesting. But all the people who are played by white actors, they can't be played by anyone else. So that's important, because on the converse, we do have some characters in the film who could be played by anyone, and I think in most films would be played by default white people. Here I'm particularly thinking of the detectives that Rod talks to when he thinks that black people are being abducted. I think possibly there is something going on in this scene about race, about relationships between black people that I as a white person watching it don't see. But I think also the way that they dismiss Rod's concerns could easily be played by white actors. And I think it's important that they are not like the white dismissive detectives. They look like Rod, because why can't the default be someone who looks like Rod? So this actually goes way, way further, because in the film you actually have black actors playing white people. So these are the characters whose bodies have already been inhabited by white people, so they've already been like abducted, hypnotized and messed with. So they actually have the consciousness of white people living within them. I think it's important to point out that for quite a long time in the film, when Chris has arrived at the house, for about half an hour, maybe 45 minutes, the jump scares and the haunting aspects are actually provided by the presence of black characters. And this kind of makes the audience feel unsettled by these characters as much as it does Chris. For example, The other thing that I really noticed on the second viewing is that the reason Chris is so disturbed by these black characters is not just because they literally make him jump, but it's because they're behaving like white people.
Yeah. I didn't get to meet you, actually, up close. I'm Chris.
I know who you are. She is lovely, isn't she?
Rose? Here she is.
One of a kind, top of the line, a real doggone keeper.
Right.
So Walter doesn't talk like Chris. There is like a disconnect between them that is not, but is obviously not about skin colour. It is about language and the way that he holds himself and the way that he thinks about things that sort of marks them as separate. And Chris very perceptively picks up on this very early on, because these people are behaving like they're white, because they are. So I think this gets to the heart of the idea that your ethnicity, the colour of your skin, is only a small part of that. It is about the culture and the family and the sense of self and the experience of living in a body that looks whatever way it does. Third point, I want to talk about women. So at the very beginning of the film, we have this sort of cold open where we see this character who we later find out is called Andre, and he is walking in the suburbs and he's on the phone, and he actually describes the suburbs as the creepy ass suburbs, which raises the idea of films like Halloween or Nightmare on Elm Street. These kind of like suburban horror films are really were happening in the 70s and 80s.
All right, baby. All right, I'll talk to you soon. See you. Okay, so this is mine half. It's like a fucking hedge maze out here. Let's see, just keep going straight. Look, I think it said left on, what was that? Peacock. Going straight and left. Just keep on walking, bro. Don't do nothing stupid. Just keep on. Fuck this. I was about to go the other way. I can't. Not today. Not me. You know how they like to do motherfuckers out here, man. I'm gone.
What I was really struck by watching at this time is that he's nervous because this car pulls up and he kind of feels like he's threatened in some way, and he like talks to himself, he turns around, he crosses the street, you know, he's trying to like avoid the issue. And these are things that I have done. I have so often like pretended to be on the phone or like talked to myself or, you know, done something so that if I felt vulnerable, maybe the people around me would leave me alone, either because I was talking to someone or because maybe I seemed a bit mad or something. I mean, these are things that as a woman, and I don't think I am alone, I utilise to make myself feel safer. So watching Andre do this in this film, the parallel was drawn very, very starkly for me between like, oh, I've actually had some of that experience. I know what that feels like, that particular moment. This, of course, is like not a mistake. The fact that I can draw a parallel between this film and between feminist issues is not a mistake. Jordan Peele has very purposefully built Get Out on the groundwork laid by IR11 in The Stepford Wives and to a slightly lesser extent in Rosemary's Baby, wherein the oppressed groups in those films are women, and it's particularly related again to like bodies and also to patriarchy and to this sort of suburban ideal of propriety, let's say. In Get Out, Peele kind of lovingly takes that work that Levin has done and uses it to address the oppression of black people. And I think this is just such a beautiful parallel and such a beautiful gesture. There is something about it that makes me feel like I'm part of the conversation and that I should be, and that I should have some responsibility, and this idea that groups that have had to sort of campaign for their rights should be using each other's strategies and supporting one another. Peele actually even says in an interview that, you know, it has a lot to do with the way that we perhaps think about women. He says, I still think that if you're a woman in a room, you're still thought of as a woman before you're thought of as a human being. And he draws that parallel as being like, if you're a black person in a room, you are thought of as black before you're thought of as human. So that parallel is right there, and Peele is using it on purpose. So it's no wonder that I feel some affinity with Andre at the beginning. And just to sort of make that parallel even stronger, so the Stepford Wives is built on the slogan, sisterhood is powerful, and to the same extent, Get Out is built on the slogan, Black Lives Matter. So how does the film read now in June 2020, where there is incredible power and anger in the world, an incredible sense of betrayal and hurt about the way that human beings are being treated? And so I wondered, in a world where the racism that we're seeing, the racism that is being fought against is so overt, how does this film that deals with a sort of subtler form of racism feel? Right now, subtle forms of racism are not front and centre. There is nothing subtle about what happened to George Floyd or Breonna Taylor. And as I say those names, I'm also really aware that these are two individuals who lost their lives and who are kind of being used as like poster children for many, many more individuals who have been either injured or killed due to racism. There is nothing subtle about those murders. They are horrific and overt and racist. And that kind of racism, that overt racism, is built on a foundation of insidious, subtle racism. And that's the kind of racism that the film is addressing. So finally, I wanted to talk about the ending. At the very end of the film, we find Chris strangling his white girlfriend, who has already been shot, after having kind of picked off her family one by one in his escape. And a police car comes towards the house and kind of lights them up, and they both look up and they look at this car. Now, Jordan Peele says that originally the idea was that a white police officer would get out of this car, which would, of course, put Chris as a black man in a much direr situation. And he wanted to do that to remind people who voted for Obama that they were not living in a post-racial world. However, he apparently felt that he needed to counter public anger and pain caused by police brutality against black people. So instead, at the end of the film, what he gives us is a hero, an escape, and a positive feeling. I'm quoting articles below. And when I first watched the film, in my ignorance, when the police car showed up at the end, I think that I was relieved, as I would be as a middle-class white woman, like relieved that authority and safety is here. When I rewatched it yesterday, I was really struck, even though I know who gets out of the car and that we do get this escape, I was really struck by the potential, that moment where Rose reaches out and says, help me, and there really is a possibility that the person who gets out of that car will be there to help her and not him. So on the one hand, I think that the ending that we get, where Chris escapes, where he survives, is powerful because we feel a kinship with Chris and our hearts can follow him beyond the end of the film. But I also wonder if right now it potentially reads as a kind of betrayal of reality. The film as a whole, I think, really echoes, and we are not just left with this ending. We are left with the entire narrative that exists. But right now, as I look out at the world, as I look at the state that our world is in, I wonder, isn't the fact that he survives really just the bare minimum? Thank you for watching this, and I hope that I have dealt with these issues with some insight and some sensitivity. It's really hard to talk about, but I think if we don't talk about it and make mistakes and learn, we are just not going to go anywhere. So I will be educating myself, and I hope that everyone out there is also doing the same. If you feel inclined to share this, if I've said anything useful or insightful, please do share it. Usually I would ask you to like follow me and bid for, you know, like followers and stuff. I would just like to say today that it is only my job to educate myself. I'm the only person who is responsible for making sure that I know what I'm talking about. But if you want to reach out and engage or correct, I welcome that, particularly on this issue. I think that we should be talking. So in the spirit of that, I invite you to comment below or follow me on Twitter. I really welcome being corrected, being pointed at more useful resources. And in the meantime, I will be pointing myself at more useful resources.